last but not least, Nathanael Reed is a printmaker, quilter, and collage artist, originally from Salt Lake City, Utah. His work examines the legacy of westward expansion. He has exhibited his work nationally in Utah, Montana, Georgia, Virginia, and Connecticut. So please welcome Nathanael Reed.
I had to check to make sure that the recording was still going. Hello, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for hanging out as long as you have. This is great. So I'm the dude from the West, and as Monica mentioned, my artwork talks about the legacy of westward expansion. Growing up out in the West, specifically Colorado and Utah, I was surrounded by it. It permeated everything about my experience, but I didn't really understand what it was until I grew older, especially by the time I hit my 20s. But one thing that was core to me that I realized is that there was always a disconnect. That even though I grew up there, I didn't quite feel like I fit in. And a big chunk of that comes from the fact that my family are transplants to the area, and so we didn't have those generational ties. And also our traditions growing up were very ad hoc because our families weren't anywhere close. Our extended families, it felt like every year, every tradition we did was like made up in the moment, and then it never lasted for the next year. And so that led to this idea that I felt very lacking of a cultural identity. I didn't feel, because there was nothing I could look at and say like, I'm a Utahn. No, that didn't quite work. And to say simply an American felt way too vague. And so a lot of that, I questioned it, but I really didn't do anything about it until I met my wife, Nikita. And Nikita's grandfather is a Portuguese immigrant, and their Portuguese culture means everything to the family, and they couldn't be any more different from my own. For them, there was tradition in everything. There is a specific food that she associates with just about every experience, whether it's a holiday or just like a cold morning. And her family is all live in California now, and so everyone was always close to each other and all up in everyone's business. And so there was this clear idea that there was this was something different. And so when I married into this family, it was a bit of a shocker, but it also helped me begin to see that what I didn't have and what I was lacking. And so the biggest example of that happened when we took a trip to the Azores. Her grandfather went back for the first time since he immigrated. What was it, 2018? Because that's when he got married. My wife is nodding to confirm. Anyway, and we went to the Azores, and he is from the island of Fayal, and so we were there for a week. Saw lots of great stuff from whaling towers to black sand beaches. Met cousins that no one had ever met before, and it was a wonderful experience. But having just married into this family, it was a lot to process. And so when we came home, I ended up making the largest print I had ever made to that point. And that's what you're looking at here. And so right here you can see that's Nikita doing her shoe. That's a whaling tower. That's me holding this monument. That's a grandpa. So I made a lot of stuff processing this. And in the process of making this, I came to the realization that I kind of became at least an identity that I vaguely, or at least more related to, and that was that of a Western American. But I didn't really have a clear idea as to what that meant. So I began to read prolifically, and I applied to grad school. So eventually I came here, and I made a lot of work off of all these ideas that I had dumped in my mind. And instead, the first couple months of making work, or the first semester or two, I made a lot of stuff that was way too big picture. Just like Thomas struggled with where it felt academic, I also made stuff where I was getting lost, and I didn't quite have a place to be. So after not quite succeeding a few times, I eventually realized that I needed to understand how all this stuff related to me and how I saw it in my life. So I went to my sketchbook and spent an immense amount of time there. And so you can see a lot of like a selection of these drawings. And when my professors started to respond to this and say there's something special here, I realized that the sketchbook could be more than just a place for developing ideas, but it could be something for it could be the like end product in and of itself. So I did that, and that led to the book, which you can see at the back of the room in the corner. It's not lit up right now, but this book was a 2.5-year project, and it is the anchor for just about everything that I did here. And the two books that inspired it the most, or at least gave me a roadmap for it, are Terry Tempest Williams' book of Refuge and Lauren Redness's book of Oak Flat. Both are a landscape history book that they tie with the biographical narratives of the area. Refuge talks about the Great Salt Lake and ties it specifically with the flooding in the 1980s and the death of the author's mother. And then Oak Flat is instead talking about a sacred space in southern Arizona that settler colonialism has had a lot to do with, and it's a very complex situation. But they gave me this, and so now I have The Dude from the West, and it's a stuffed full book that's supposed to feel like a sketchbook that I couldn't help but keep putting more and more and more stuff. And so there's something about the journalistic qualities of it all that makes it feel like it's truly me recording this. And so within the book, I talk about 3 things. I talk about the landscape, the community, and the faith that I grew up in, and how each of those were influenced by the legacy of conquest. First is the landscape. So growing up in the Salt Lake Valley, you have these dramatic mountains around you, as well as these wide open spaces and the Great Salt Lake right there. And all of these things really were formative to my identity and how I saw my life. And to the point that I used mountains to like direct myself. I knew where, if I looked at the mountains, I knew they were my east, and so I always knew what direction I was headed. The mountains became core to my mental health and other things like that, and getting out and experiencing this landscape. And so that was key. And I also talk not just about natural landscapes, but some man-made landscapes. And a lot of that starts to tie into the community. And so the community we grew up in was not only we were transplants, but we are converts to the LDS Church, or Mormons if you don't know the acronym. And so we landed in Salt Lake in a neighborhood where we were not only transplants, but being a convert meant that the local church that we attended, we were always on the periphery. And that was a difficult thing, especially when you're 8, 9, 10 years old and trying to find friends. And the only time I got invited to like my neighbor's pool was the first week we moved in. And so all of this like resentment and small hurts that were never malicious, but instead it was just something that just kind of happened, kind of became focused and hyper-focused on Lake Powell specifically. And Lake Powell is a reservoir in southern Utah that is a complex situation, but I staunchly have come down on the side of it needs to be destroyed, not because of any good environmental reason, but because I'm petty. And so that's why this definitely one of my favorite spreads in the entire book, because you can see how childish I can be sometimes. But speaking especially about the church and our faith, the faith in particular is always a little bit difficult to talk about because it's such a big topic. And so in the book I only scratched the surface, but I centered the discussion mostly about how it's through my faith that I begin to learn to live with contradiction, which I think is something that everyone lives with in some way or another. And for example, this is the Salt Lake Temple right there, and that is a sacred building to me. It is the place where I've had many sacred experiences, including getting married to Nikita right here. But the building, it's a sacred place, but it lives on stolen land. And there's a lot of extra context in a lot of the history of all this, which really makes things sometimes difficult to live with. So I encourage you to go check it out when you get the chance. But not everything made it into the book, and so eventually I went on and I started to make quilts. And this is my great aunt Sarah, who this picture was, I think she was like 32, 33, about the same age as me, and she was a prolific quilter in her life. And so everything, all in all the quilts that you will see, the majority of the fabric was once hers. And so I've inherited that fabric, and I've also inherited one of her sewing machines. And so each of these quilts, and as I make them, they've been a way for me to not only create a cultural connection with like the greater history that I have of quilting and early settlers of the West, but also have a very personal connection with my aunt, who I didn't know very well while she was alive. And so the first quilt I made is I grew up here, and this is a map of the neighborhood that I grew up in. And so after writing that chapter about Lake Powell, I realized I needed to, move on and forgive. And so this quilt became that way I did it. And so I decided to use a quilt for its base purpose, which is to bring warmth and comfort. And so I made the quilt as a map, and you can see, these are streets and houses and stuff. And then I drew. You can faintly see some of the drawings I drew with the sewing machine, some good experiences in this neighborhood. And the two things I want to point out the most is that this white shirt here was the plot where the church laid on, and that's a white shirt that I wore to church until it was too ratty to keep wearing. And then this shirt right here is the saltiest rowers on earth, and that's a shirt I wore in high school. And that's the house that we grew up in. But it's as I made this quilt, I began to sort of feel like I moved on, but I definitely feel like the healing has really happened the most as Nikita and I have snuggled under it during the cold this past winter, as it's been on the cold days. And so the next quilt this is the only quilt in the world that wonders what it is. The title is actually an appropriation of a quote from Neil Gaiman's book, American Gods. In the book, the character Mr. Wednesday, speaking about America, says, "This is the only country in the world that worries about what it is." And when I read that, I related to it so much, because it felt like that's exactly who I was. I was an American questioning who I was and wondering about it and worrying about it. And so through the unfinished nature of the entire piece, about the fact that I didn't finish the edges, the batting is exposed. There's even a piece right here that's like reversed. I wanted to like show about how it's this ad hoc conglomeration of like trying to figure this out. And it also features my favorite self-portrait I have ever made. It's beautiful. And the last quilt I'm going to talk about is the most recent one, which is Quiltelope, which you can see right over here. And this is, oh geez, what's that? Oh no. Oh, there we go. Okay. I pressed the wrong button. My bad. Okay, so with Quiltelope, this is me. I've recently become really fascinated by jackalopes and how they are this weird hybrid creature and mythic creature that we've made that is just about as real as the mythic cowboy, which I'll talk about in a second. But how I just relate to them, and I think that they're something that I want to explore some more, and about how that same nature of they're made by just putting antlers on a taxidermied rabbit, and so I feel that same feeling about like sometimes I just want to do that and like make it real even though it's not. And so and ultimately, if I'm wondering about being a Western American, I can't not talk about cowboys. So this is me talking about the mythic cowboy and paper dolls. And so the mythic cowboy, I think the easiest way to describe it is just think of John Wayne or Clint Eastwood as in any of those movies that they did, whether it's The Searchers, I'm not gonna make a giant list, but essentially, the basic idea is it's a character that walks into a complex, difficult, tough situation and solves whatever the problem might be through violence and through sheer force of will. That their way is the best way to fix the problem, and that's a very tempting way to look at the world, because like I wish that some of my problems I could just solve by coming in and with my own force of will and change it, but that's not really how the world works. And so this really began. This is my first attempt with it, with this piece. It has never yet melted, which is a quote from D.H. Lawrence, but this is a print I made for a print exchange back in 2021, but it really didn't find its final form until I figured out how to frame it, how to give it a place to be. And so Catherine Nelson right here, actually I was discussing with her once, and we came up with this idea, and I love the idea of these textile pieces living in a domestic textile storage place, because it references how the myth of the cowboy lives at home, and that's where we learn about it. But the main thing I want to focus on with this is actually this guy right here. So that's the first time I dressed myself up, and I did it as a digital collage and screen printed it. And then I was talking with Professor Emily Larned about it, and she said, "Why don't you take this further?" So I was like, "Sure, that sounds great." And that's what eventually led to the paper dolls. And the paper dolls are me continuing to dress myself up, but instead of it being a digital collage, it's a physical collage that I've sewed and glued together. I'm using an actual print of myself, or a piece of a print of myself, and then putting stuff and connecting all these things, and then making these fun paper dolls that I probably had the most fun making the first run of 20 of these that I've had in a long time of making art, except maybe the animations. But and then I also named them accordingly. Like we have Nate Wesley the Kid Powell, Tano Noodle Arms Cruz, and Brigham Reed the Rock Climbing Homesteader. And each one of these names have not only a piece of my own name, but then a piece of either the character I'm using in the collage, or more historical figures such as John Wesley Powell or Brigham Young. But eventually, I got to this point where I made them and they were looking great, and then Professor Allison Paul came to me and said they need to move, and I was like, nah, I think they're fine. And then a month later, she was like, they need to move. Anyway, and she was right, obviously. So the first animation I made was No Bastard, and it is. I take the opening scene of Patton, and for those of you who haven't seen it, it is a film from the 1960s, and the opening scene is this like grand and absurd speech that George C. Scott gives as Patton, talking about American exceptionalism and how it's going to win them World War II. And so I decided I needed to dress myself up as Patton, as this cowboy-like character, and try to give the same speech. And if you watch the animation, it doesn't go that well. And I end up shooting myself in the foot. And so after that, I went on to make another animation, where instead this one is called the Gringo Standoff. And this is taking the ending scene of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where I dress myself up as all three characters having a standoff with myself. And in this, I was thinking specifically about how, as a child, my play and my magical imagination time was always rooted in playing as a cowboy or a Jedi or a knight or something else, and something always centered around a violent or a combative nature. And so I wanted to talk about how that same childhood instinct still lives in me today, where if I pick up a Nerf gun, I will definitely go find someone to shoot with it. And if I pick up a stick that feels vaguely sword-like, I definitely make like lightsaber sounds and stuff with it. So So with these animations and with all this work that I've done, it has become very clear to me that in Connecticut, all I have are trees, and I need to go back out west. So, even though I have a fraught relationship with my homeland, I look forward to be able to return out west and to be able to make the work in the place that really feeds and fuels me. And it just doesn't make sense to stay away any longer. So I look forward to the day when my ink dries in the beautiful desert air. Okay, Haley then Annie. I mean, a lot of it came from my committee constantly being like, "Do you really need to be talking about this?" But a lot of it also came from I started out by writing first. Because in the initial drawings, there's only like 2 or 3 drawings in the entire book that I didn't necessarily make specifically for it, and so I wrote every chapter out first, and that definitely did a lot of the informing. And so like after I wrote them, I reviewed them with not only my professors but my wife as well, and we kind of like narrowed it down, and that helped knowing like what to do. And then when it came to like putting stuff in, it definitely helped, like, because I spent almost the entire time I was drawing it, like collecting the items and being like, what would go really great on this page is something related. Like there's a chapter where I talk about Brighton's ski resort, and so I was like maybe I can find my old season pass or something, and so like it felt a lot of like collecting of those types of things. Yeah. Okay, Annie. Hey.
So something I'm curious about is when you show self as the figure that you're critiquing, how are you walking the line between veneration and disdain?
Well, I think I tried very hard not to do the veneration thing, specifically by always making sure that I'm making a little bit of fun of it. Especially when you look at like the paper dolls right here. I tried to make sure that they were never truly felt like they were living, like they were solid. Like I wanted them to be fragile. I wanted it to make sure that you knew that you could like grab it and rip it off without much issue. And so, but it really is a strange line to walk. And I wouldn't say that every single time I did it successfully. That's why there's 20 of them. And so, I think right now I'm at 27 or 28. But yeah. Go ahead, Amira.
I was wondering how like contemporary culture of humor kind of figures into this, because when I saw the stand, when you told me about the standoff of the 3 cowboys who were calling you, and then they picked the Spider-Man stand.
Oh, 100%. In fact, I think I often I think I'm definitely influenced by meme culture, and there's no way that same type of humor doesn't slowly bleed into my work no matter what I try to do. And it's often a problem where I'm like I shouldn't be funny about this moment. So yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you.